Hi, I'm Ron Lemon, and I'll be your art instructor for the next 3 hours. The content on this DVD is drawing the male portrait, from fundamentals to the finish. Now let's get started. Most of my demonstrations will be done with these three pencils: the wooden graphite pencil, the mechanical graphite pencil, and the charcoal pencil. The mechanical pencil gives you more exacting lines, while the wooden pencils allow you more variety because of the side. And then with the charcoal pencil, I have it in the sleeve, and the sleeve allows me to lay the pencil down on its side to maximize the size of the pencil blade that I sharpen it to. Holding the pencil, you want the pencil as light in your hand as possible, almost as if someone could knock it right out of your hand if someone bumped it, just like that. I don't squeeze down on the pencil very hard, because the harder you squeeze on the pencil, the more damage you do to your wrist. So with a very light grip, you should be able to lay down some nice tone. You should be able to get a nice consistent edge. And if you hold the pencil sideways, you should get pretty straight lines as well. So a wooden pencil is sharpened with a point so that you can lay the side of it down and maximize the scale of the blade that you've sharpened. Much like a charcoal pencil, you can really open the blade up and get the most out of the line that you're looking for. And if you hold the pencil in varying degrees in your hand, either more towards the tip or more towards the side, you should be able to get a wide range of lines from very, very thin to the entire width of the blade. And holding the blade sideways will allow you to do more organic lines from thick to thin. We have to hold the pencil a little differently sometimes to draw certain lines and certain arcs. So there's a few different ways of holding the pencil. You can hold it as if you were writing, or you can hold it sideways in your hand like you're holding a baton. Here I'm using my finger as a pressure point, but I'm holding the pencil sideways. And by holding it sideways, I have a lot more flexibility with the pencil. I have a lot more momentum, movement, and so forth. Now, when you're holding a pencil with an extender, the idea is to find an extender that doesn't get in the way of the pencil. And when you're using a mechanical pencil, if you draw out the lead far enough, you should be able to pull the lines that you're looking for effectively. Freehand ellipses are quite a challenge. You have to hold the pencil sideways in order to get them to connect together correctly. And then you want to practice them at every degree possible, from a perfect circle to a straight line. You want to try to avoid the little fishtails or the overlapping edges at the very back end. And you want to try to avoid making ovals or ellipses with your hand as if you were writing. Your wrist will get in the way of making a perfect circle or a perfect ellipse. The other thing to avoid would be the football ends or the pinches at both ends of an ellipse. The idea would be to get the hand to swing an ellipse as freely as possible so there aren't any binding edges anywhere. If you draw an ellipse too many times, you won't know which circle to trace or track. And then the same thing will happen if you don't draw all the way through and around the shape. You'll end up with the lines disconnected. To draw a straight line, you have to draw from the shoulder or from the elbow, not from the wrist. From the wrist, the hand has too small a movement and will create a rotation. But from the elbow or the shoulder, we have a greater chance of drawing a much straighter line, and a longer line at that. It's much easier to draw the straight line and draw it away from you than it is to try to draw it towards you. Drawing it towards you sort of restricts the movement and makes the line waver a little bit. It's just a little bit harder to control when drawing towards you. But drawing away from you, everything is much more fluid. Now, the idea of drawing a straight line is so that you can quickly indicate things of a mechanical nature, such as a cube, and not end up with curvilinear lines. They're a little bit more difficult to, one, measure, and two, straighten out once they've been drawn in. So drawing and staggering the wrist. The first two lines I drew here were chicken scratched in, where all of these lines are now flowing. Chicken scratch basically means I'm just etching along little bit by little bit. And these lines I'm drawing are nice and fluid, regardless of its length. Whether they're short lines or long lines, I want the most fluid line as possible. The cleaner the line, the easier the read. The art of the straight line is going to be very helpful when we shade. When we shade a picture, we draw lines that are parallel, much like these. Now let's build a box, let's build a space so that we can shade in. And shading isn't necessarily done with the pencil tip. In fact, it's probably easier if you use the broad side of the pencil to fill a form. So we're going to take the side of the pencil here and start a tone, and we're going to pass it in one direction, not in both directions like this. If you go back and forth, you'll end up with tails. And with opening or with shading in one direction, you're opening up the end to make more tone connect with it evenly and consistently. These little tails that we have on our shading create a little dark mark, and that little dark mark has to eventually be erased out, which means more work. Now, if you can shade in one even coat or in one direction consistently, you don't have as much cleanup work to do, and that gives you a lot more quality time to finish your drawing. Now when we're shading, we're hatching, and hatching is a series of parallel lines. And the closer and tighter you push those parallel lines to each other, the more even and uniform the tone. The lines could be curvy, the lines could be straight, just as long as those lines create a direction. Each of those little directional lines overlapping other directional little lines create little patches, and each of these patches connected together eventually lead to a larger surface or the three-dimensional objects that we're trying to draw. Now the closer you get these lines to each other, the more evenly spaced and the smoother your tone will be. If you press too hard all at once, you end up scoring the paper, both on the back side and on the front side. You'll feel relief to it. So to darken a tone or to make the tone more even, the best way to do it is to build up a series of layers over and over again to create a nice even tone. There's another way of shading which is called veiling, and that's where you spin your hand in a slow circular motion, which my hand right now is not moving very slow, but in a slow circular motion you'll get a nice even tone, much like hatching if you hatch in one direction. They'll both create nice consistent tones. Before we get too caught up in the rendering and the likeness and so forth, let's talk about the average proportions of the human skull. Now, these are ideal proportions. These are not the individual proportions, as we each have our own. The profile of the head will fit into a perfect square, and inside of a perfect square we know we can put a perfect circle as well as an isosceles triangle, things that we can actually use to design the head with. The 4 points of the profile touch down on that square. If we start with a soft triangle to represent the skull mass, we can see that 3 of those edges are already occupied by the skull mass, and all we're looking for now is for the nose to touch down on the 4th edge. Altogether, that is the ideal proportion of the human head. Afterwards, you flesh it out a little bit further. Now, to go from the side to the front, what we're going to do is we're going to take measurements from the square. We're going to divide one of the edges of the square into thirds, and we're going to take 2 of those thirds and bring them over to our front view, and that roughly is the proportion of the front to the side. Now within the front view, rather than drawing a triangular form, we're going to draw an ovoid form, or an oval, and this again is for the ideal human form. This first construction method I'm showing is called the Riley method, the Riley technique. It's a series of abstractions or rhythmical lines that connect anatomy, both muscles and bones together, to form a map of the head. Here I've divided the head into thirds, from the hairline to the top of the eyes to the bottom of the nose, and to the chin. Next I put the ears into the picture, and those sit within that middle third, and the temples fit in the upper third of the head. The cheekbones, that's what this rhythm represents here, fit somewhere in the middle third, and using a rhythm to go from side to side, it helps get the cheekbones squared up perfectly with each other, or symmetrical to one another. Next is the nose, working from the tip of the nose to the top of the nose where the glabella is, then finding the rhythm that helps to note the side planes where they connect to the face. The eyeballs next, and the eye sockets. I'm building 2 separate shapes, but then connecting them together using rhythms through the corners of the eye as well as the top construction of the eye socket. The corners of the eyes line up with the corners of the nose, or the tear ducts of the eyes line up with the wings of the nostril. The mouth rhythm, or the tooth cylinder, and the laugh line here are the next set of rhythms to find the muzzle of the face. Now I'm going around and chopping up the skull into planes, side planes, 3/4 planes, top plane. From the top of the ears to the corners of the mouth, there's a rhythm line that connects these pieces together. And then from the bottom of the same point, which is called the helix of the ear, from the bottom of the helix, it separates that rhythm line, separates the muzzle in the front from the masseter muscles on the back or behind that rhythm line. And those rhythm lines also aim down towards the chin of the head. The forehead or frontalis plane then divides the 2 3/4 planes of the front of the head. So we have 3 blocks, front and 2 side planes. Then we have what's called the glabella. This is the top half of it that goes into the brow rhythm. The frontalis, the 2 3/4 planes, and the 2 side planes. 5 planes altogether in rough mathematical indications. And then finally we block out the rest of the rhythms of the mouth and what's called the philtrum, just below the nose. So now moving on to the side plane of the head, or the profile, we could start with a box, because typically the ideal head will fit into a square. The top of the head, the back of the head, and the jaw rest on 3 edges of that square, and then finally the tip of the nose is the last portion of that square that we need to map out, and the tip of that rests upon the last edge of the box. I've divided the head into thirds, found a rhythm line in the front that goes into the eye sockets. It's sort of a sweeping line that cuts in that gives me an indication of the angle of the eye sockets. Then we move on to the jaw. The back of the jaw is at a slant, and the ear fits in the middle third of that slant. And you can see that the ear is not straight up and down, it's actually at an angle, lined up with the jaw. We move into the nose and the eye sockets. And there's a few rhythms over in here that we want to take into consideration as well that reflect the same rhythms from the front of the head. Now what I'm doing is blocking in big basic rhythms, and then I'll go back within those rhythms and cut down the smaller shapes like I did with the brow. Here's the side plane of the head. In the front view, it's the 2 little wedges on either side of the skull. That space is where the eye socket falls back. Now we're using the same rhythm line that we found at the top of the ear and at the top of the helix and at the bottom of the helix to find both the corner of the mouth and the masseter muscle division. Going in and cleaning up the eye socket, removing any extraneous lines that might throw off the proportions, and of course there's always room for improvement. The sweep of the neck, both lines of the neck are going to fall back at an angle slightly so the neck doesn't feel like it's propped up on a stick. The interior of the ear can be divided into thirds. The upper third finds the helix, the antihelix. The middle third finds the concha, or the whole of the ear. The lower third finds the lobe of the ear. Then we have all the smaller planes, the subtle planes, the divisions in the nose, the split of the lips, the throat, the sternocleidomastoideus muscle, the C7, and the sternal notch. Now moving on to the 3/4 view, we carry the same lines over, the same top and bottom lines to help keep the scale of the head somewhat consistent with the other drawings. The 3/4 line, or the center line of the head that's at 3/4 view, has been drawn in so that we can build everything else surrounding that. The profile line on the outside of the head helps us find the 3/4 line on the interior of the head, as I've done here, and that begins the chain reaction of everything else from the eye sockets on. The nose has been found at the glabella, and here I'm now looking for the bridge of the nose to build the extrusion of it. I found the nose first at the flat of the face plane before extruding it out. It makes it much easier to build the nose and keep the symmetry from one side to the other. Sometimes it's also a good idea to start the eye socket before the nose, just so you have a way of designing the eye before you extrude the nose out. And you can see that with the rhythms found in both the front and the side drawing, the 3/4 view comes together fairly quick. Here I've found all of the rhythms from the cheeks, through the ear, through the mouth. I found the rhythm lines around the mouth, the muzzle line, and the laugh line. And all I'm doing is sweeping through the center line and looking for the symmetry from one side to the other to make certain that everything feels or looks like it should feel or look symmetrical. And I say look and feel because some of us are going to see it, some of us are going to feel it. I'm designing a few shadow patterns in here so that you can see what these planes represent. Filling each of the underplanes in to show this as if the model is being top lit. And I think this better describes the surfaces that are divided up. The back of the jaw and the ear cast a shadow, and they blend together, sometimes making the jaw look like it's in the ear instead of in front of the ear. But keep in mind that the ear is behind the jaw technically if we were to uncover the flesh and remove the muscles. So the last few things here that I'm polishing up on are the neck rhythms, and I should have found all of the necks at the same height. I think it's a good idea to find them at the same time that you're drawing the picture and don't put them in as an afterthought. All construction lines go together, and they should help solve the problem all at once. You don't want to put little bit by little bit in. You want to get the biggest and the most important things out of the way first, and then work your way down to the smaller things. And as you see here, I'm working out the smaller issues. I'm fine-tuning the shapes a little bit further, and it's a much easier process to do this when the big picture has been laid in. That last rhythm on all three of the heads is the brow rhythm. It goes from eye socket to eye socket and is cut by the glabella in the center. This next technical approach is called the construction method. And with the construction method, we'll be working similarly to what we saw in the Riley abstractions, but in terms of measuring and some of the basic shapes that you saw. But there's a slightly different approach. Here we start with the big oval, and I'm drawing the head at a skew view so that we can see the side plane working with this. So I've found the big oval, and I've morphed the oval so that it has a little bit more of a likeness to a skull. I'm kind of likening it to the jawline, the back of the head, and the top of the head having their peaks and valleys where they should. Once the oval has been morphed, the center line is drawn in, and then a pitch line, or the line that runs across the brow that I put in here, define the angle of the head. Then the neck goes on. And the same thing happens with the neck. What I'm doing in there, I've divided the oval, or the volume of the neck, with crosshairs from the C7 to the sternal notch, and then the horizontal line would run out towards the acromion processes, or the corners of your shoulders. And these are axes lines to line up all of the hard shapes that go together that when we draw in 2 dimensions doesn't look 3-dimensional at all. Now I'm going back up to the face plane, and along the eye line I've found the shape of the eye sockets, and the eye sockets are going to be what are called scalloped shapes, or cut out of the head. I start with the wedge lines. The lines are the angles that show the amount of scallop in the skull, and those are the outside angle lines on both eye sockets. And then inside of that mass I put in, or inside of that space, I put in an eyeball. Once the eyeballs have been found, I then move them around until they look like they relate to each other from tear duct to tear duct. Then it's much easier to build the nose. So the eyeballs represent spheres, the nose represents a cone shape, or a primitive cone shape, as you see here, front plane, bottom plane of the nose, that can be divided in half so that you find the left side from the right side. And then we have the side plane of the nose. 2 sides of them. Looking through the nose as if it were transparent, we can see that this is sort of like a gold bar, tapering at one end. And that's what we found here on the model. We found a 3-dimensional shape using surfaces, and these lines that I'm indicating here are the direction that those surfaces are traveling in this particular drawing. So lightly I'm going to etch in these lines, and these lines also go in the direction of the perspective of that surface. That's the way I've drawn them. Now I'm fine-tuning the eye sockets and connecting the brow to them, or the temples to them. We're looking at the eye sockets, and they represent the scalloped forms, and here you can see that I'm drawing what would look like a whistle, if you remember the old whistles that are metal shaped. This hole would be the aperture for the whistle. This hole also represents the eye socket on the skull. It's cut away, and on the inside of that floats a ball. So here we have a cup shape that I've made, and inside the cup I placed a ball. And that's also another way of remembering what the eye socket is like as you're drawing it. There are overlapping shapes, and that's what these series of construction shapes represent. When you draw them all in together, they represent the overlap or the three-dimensional space and how they all relate to each other. The muzzle and the chin are both ball-shaped. You can think of the muzzle, they call it the tooth cylinder, but it's actually ball-like because it curves from the interior of the nose out to the front of the lips and then back in just above the chin. And it cuts back in towards the bone, and it causes a termination point where the chin begins. So this shape is rounded. I kind of think of it like an orange. And you use the one side of the orange to represent the curvature of where the mouth goes. And then the same thing with the chin. It's a curvilinear surface. It's not a planed out surface. And so we're using a ball shape to represent that. And here I'm shading the eyeballs in so that we can see all shapes together, equally lit in their shape found method. Spheres for the eyes, a spheroid type shape for the mouth, a spheroid type shape for the chin, a cone-like shape or a brick-like shape for the nose, gold brick that is, and then the whistle shape or the ball and cup for the eye socket. And here I'm shading in the surfaces. I'm shading in the cheekbones, the glabella, around the muzzle, and I'm showing which direction the surfaces go in using shapes, simple shapes. The big muzzle shape or the lines on either side of the mouth represent a larger sphere, and you can see that the edge that I've created is very soft. The side plane of the head has also been shaded down so we can see the division from one side to the other. The neck is a cylinder, and I'm shading it with a cast shadow in mind. The head is casting a shadow down onto that cylinder form, just as the nose would cast a shadow down into the muzzle, as we've done here. Continuing to darken these shapes continues to open up more room for the halftones, so I can continue modeling out into the lights instead of just in the darks. And I don't want to minimize the amount of modeling I do. I actually want to maximize it for the sake of learning, then edit and minimize for the sake of doing. So all these lines together are hopefully pulling the head around into a volumetric object, 3 dimensions, with both the top, the side, the bottom, and the far side turning just enough to give the illusion of 3-dimensional space. Here are the lines that represent the front planes of the face, things that are facing straight forward towards the viewer, along in the cheekbones, the muzzle, the front of the chin, and the forehead, and around the muzzle just slightly are some surfaces that face forward. And then everything else just past that faces away from the viewer, or away from straight forward. Everything starts to turn at an angle, 45, roughly between 30 and 45 degree angles. And then finally the side plane. Here I've scalloped out the neck so you can see the cylindrical mass within that. The side planes of the head I'm also kind of drawing in a perspectival view so you can see which direction the eye would travel as it's moving across the surfaces. And that's basically what hatch lines do. Taking the ear apart a little bit, we're going to look at it in the way its shapes have been found. Here we're drawing a little wheel, and the wheel has an interior lip and an exterior lip, and I'm shading in the interior so that you can see its cutaway view. And that's what the helix represents up along the top edge of the ear. We have that hollow. And then on the inside of that, we scoop in the line. We don't think of it as a continuation, but it bends under, and then it folds into the inside of the ear. At the bottom of the ear, we have the lobe, and that's a softer mass, and it spreads out a little bit more. In between those two edges, we have what's called the concha, or the hollow of the ear. Up underneath the wing of the ear, we have the antihelix. The wing of the ear is called the helix. Underneath it is called the antihelix, and that's what that little dark tab represents. Let's start with the construction of the eye. We'll begin with a simple circle and a series of circles. A larger circle for the eyeball, the white of the eye, the sclera. A smaller circle for the iris, and a smaller circle yet for the pupil. And then we have another one over here that's slightly skewed for the highlight of the eye. Now you can see that I pushed the pupil back into the eye or over to the left of the drawing just slightly, and what that gives is an indication. It makes us feel, and it gives the illusion that we are looking at the eye not straight forward but at a slight angle. Around the highlight of the eye, that's where the darkest values should sit within the iris. And then as that moves over to the other side of the eye, the highlight on the eye, as you see here, this is representing the eye lens at a slight angle. You can see that the lens of the eye is lifted up like a dome, and the light that goes through the eye scatters across the eye on the far side, giving it the light that we have up in the sample above. And then because it's scattering it on the far side, most of the shade sits just below that highlight, making the highlight feel even more extravagant, brighter, sharper. The iris of the eye can also be thought of as a bowl. And in that bowl, we sit the pupil at the very bottom. This is a trick that illustrators do. It creates the illusion that the eye is looking in a very specific direction. And as you see here, I'm drawing several different versions of that iris and pupil, and you can see that where I'm placing the circle within the bigger circle is giving the illusion of distance or direction that the eye is looking in. The distance meaning the edges of the bigger oval and where the smaller oval sits. There's a certain distance from one side versus the other, closer and further. Wherever that lens sits inside the eye, the lid lifts. You can see here I put the lens in the very middle of the eye, or the iris in the very middle, and as a result, the upper lid lifts over the top of that in the middle of the eye. Now, if we were to place that on the left side or right side, the lid would lift in that direction. The fold of the eye here that I'm drawing represents that upper lid, and then just up above that is what's called the orbicularis oculi. It's the muscle of the eye. This contour line that I just drew represents the muscle, the lid, then the round of the eye, then the lower lid, and then the muscle of the eye again. If we look at the lid, the upper lid one more time, here's 3 different examples of where the iris is looking. We have the iris looking to the right, to the left, and straight forward. And you can see that the highest point of the upper lid is overlapping that lens. So that's another symbol that will help indicate which direction someone's looking in if we're having a hard time getting the eyes to feel that way. Using all of these different ideas, we can then construct an eyeball using almost any means. Here I'm putting an eyeball together starting with all the dark shapes, and I'm assuming that the light source is coming from the right side, crossing to the left side, causing all of the shadows to occur on the left side as a result. The eyebrow and the orbital of the eye, or the orbicularis oculi, are 2 areas of tone that you use to help blend out the edges, the lid line, the lower lids, and etc., the tear duct. That upper orbital should be a little bit darker to show that the eyeball is scalloped in. Here I've used all of the little tricks that we talked about with the iris and the pupil, creating what looks like a glow in the eye. And here now I'm pushing the tones down in the upper portion of the eye socket to make it feel like it's cut into the skull instead of flat on the skull. The ear can be thought of as a parallelogram. Here I have the top and bottom edges parallel to each other, and the 2 side walls parallel to each other, slanting towards the left. The ear can also be divided proportionately into thirds. The upper third being the helix, which is what I just drew, the lower portion of it being the lobe. The interior portion of it is called the concha, this hole. And these 2 little bits right here, the tragus and the antitragus, are cartilaginous shapes that separate the whole from the side plane of the head. And this last shape here that I put in is called the antihelix. The antihelix, nodule, and the concha both are hollows, and they're both filled darker. Now the ear can be thought of as 2 simple shapes, a question mark and a lowercase y. And when we put these 2 shapes together, putting the lowercase y inside of the question mark shape, it defines all of the rough cartilage that surrounds the whole of the ear and makes it quite simple to map all of these different pieces out. The concha, the part that I just drew in, doesn't fit into any of these little molds. You're going to have to think about that one on its own. But having the question mark shape and the Y shape there to start it all off makes it really easy to organize this space. And if you can remember to divide the ear into thirds, then it really puts all the pieces in perspective and makes it quite simple to build. Before detailing the mouth with all the little specifics, it's a good idea to have the shape underneath that the mouth sits upon. That's known as the tooth cylinder. In this case, I've kind of drawn it circular, and that's the way I think of it. I don't think of it as a cylinder per se. I think of it as a circle. And we find the points on the outside corners of the circle. We find a center line and strike a point along that, and those will be our 3 points that we define the curvature of the mouth with. And once that curvature has been put in, then we go ahead and work on the shapes of the lips. Now we don't have the nose or the chin here to reference how big or how small to make things, so we're just kind of going with the 2 points sitting in the middle of this oval and them representing the upper corners of the upper lip. The lower lip, you can see, is placed in the upper lip. It doesn't go all the way out to the corners. Well, in some cases it might, but in most cases it doesn't. And in those corners instead are these little wings that I've just drawn in. Those are called the nodes of the mouth. And the nodes are little tiny circles or little tabs that have all the muscles in the face connected to them that create the expression on the mouth. And then the little wedge that I drew underneath the lower lip represents the undercut just before we get to the chin, this shape I just drew here on this profile mouth. Now the slant line that I've drawn in here going from the tip of the nose to the lips represents the angle that all of these shapes fall into, typically, not always. They slant back starting at the nose and taper all the way back to the lower lip. Now the shape I started with over here represents the diamond, and that diamond shape is sort of what I start with when I'm looking at a mouth straight on. And here I've taken one of the tools I found in a book and I've divided the lips into its 5 different surfaces, or the upper lip having 3 separate sections and the lower lip having 2. And then in another reference I found this one where both the upper and the lower half can be thought of as having 2 segments to them, the upper being divided right down the middle, and as well as the lower being divided right down the middle. There are some arcing lines that cut through that shape, but for the most part, these are the 2 different examples that I've found in lots of different anatomy books. Now the way I draw mouths at 3/4 view is I start with a little box that represents the front flat plane of the mouth, and then I draw 2 triangles on either side of that. So I have 3 segments altogether. Then I look for the curvature of the lips and then go ahead and detail. So here again are the 3 shapes: a square that represents the flat plane or the middle, 2 triangles on either side, and I have a line that I drew through the middle of those boxes horizontally, or through those shapes horizontally, that represents the split in the lips. And then all of the other little accent marks are placed on the upper shape, and that gives the definition of the upper lip. When we start the nose, we can think of it as a prism-like shape, or a rooftop for that matter. Here's the roof, the side of the roof, and the front of the house. The front of the house is the part I'm shading dark. But if we take that top edge of the roof and shave it off or sand it down so it creates a flatter plane, this is the basic shape that we really could start the nose off with. I think this is a much simpler way to start it. The top should be smaller than the bottom so that the bottom represents where the nostrils go. Now looking at the nose in front view, here I've drawn the glabella with this first triangle. The circles represent the eyeballs. This column represents the middle of the nose, or the front plane of the nose. And the bottom triangle, all of the mass of the cartilage for the nostrils. This central diamond shape is the cartilage of the bridge of the nose. The ball is literally the ball of the nose. And then this horseshoe shape represents the side planes of the nose as it's touching the face. That little bottom triangle represents the underside of the nose, or the bottom plane. So if we take that bottom plane and we expand upon it, we can see that the bottom side of the nose, looking at just that bottom plane, is broken up into 2 distinct surfaces, a left and a right. The wedge that I've just drawn in represents the septum that separates the 2 nostrils that I'm drawing now, and these 2 curled in back sides or the 2 little wedges at the very bottom, represent the face plane and where the nostrils turn under and connect to the face. If we draw the nose in 3/4 view, I'm going to start the tip as I did with this bottom plane of the nose with a little wedge, and the two lines going to the upper left of the pad represent the perspective. So we'll be seeing more of the right side of the nose than the left side of the nose. And I started with that column shape on the inside, sort of representing that gold brick that I said would be an ideal way to begin the nose. Now, I haven't drawn any eye sockets, so I never drew the side wall of the nose. I just kind of began it, winging it, so to speak. And you can see that I place the shapes in the nose as I need them. I don't put them all in all at once like that middle chart shows. That's really confusing at a first glance, and we would never know that those shapes represent the nose if we didn't know any better. Those shapes are meant to be used on a need-to basis. Not every nose has every bit of cartilage exemplified, and in some cases, some of these shapes just don't even show up. So it would be a good way to practice by starting with that gold brick shape and then add as you need. And as you need, meaning that when things get confusing and they're tough to draw, these shapes can be broken out and they'll make life a lot simpler, make it a lot easier to describe how things are cutting apart. Now, the little wedge that I drew next to the highlight, which is represented by the oval in the top of the head, that little wedge is the side wall of the ball of the nose as it's merging into the wings of the nostril. That I haven't shown in any of these other charts because there really isn't a simple explanation for that. And from nose to nose, that varies. From profile, the nose could be started as a wedge. And then underneath the wedge, a small triangle added that represents the bottom plane. And the bottom plane isn't flat or horizontal, it actually has a little bit of slope to it. These two curves here represent the wing of the nostril and the ball of the nose. I'm separating both of those out with two different arcing lines so that I can clearly define them, and then when I go to put that little wedge line in the side plane of the nose, I know exactly where it needs to go. The two lines in the front and the back of the nose do not run parallel with each other. They actually taper as they go up into the eye socket, as I mentioned earlier with the gold brick. And here you can see the drawing has been drawn that way. The bridge is tapering towards the face plane of the nose. And that's a more appropriate design for the nose. And all these little hatch lines that I'm adding in just represent the subtle curvatures and the subtle blending of all of these harsh geometric shapes that we've started this entire demonstration with. Now, the bridge of the nose, the bump of the nose can change and vary. The cartilage changes. And here are three different versions of a nose, just very quickly. The hooked nose, the sloping nose, and then the kinked nose. And this is just three of many, many different types of noses that are out there. This first demonstration is going to be the straightforward view. Straightforward, no turn to the head, no change in elevation. We start with the oval, the simplest shape to begin with in the forward view, striking the top and the bottom to locate where my measuring points are. Knowing that I have an oval, I still need measuring points. And then I build the thirds into it. The thirds are the hairline, the eye line, the bottom of the nose, and the bottom of the chin. From there, I have drawn the glabella, the triangular wedge between the eyes, the side planes, and with the side planes I can then traverse the lines over the side plane to find the ears that are back in the head or on the side of the head in the back. So the lines have to wrap in perspective, and that's what's been done here. So anything that you start with is a generic placeholder. Everything can be molded along the way. As you see, I'm erasing little bits off of the oval as I go, looking for more of a specific likeness. All right, so now that the thirds have been blocked in, now I'm looking for all the features, or where the major building blocks of the features go. We have the eye socket, the eye sockets, we have the nose, we have the mouth or the tooth cylinder, and then from those features, we're going to be looking for the neck. Then from the neck, we look for a way to get the back to connect with the front, and that's what these rhythms are here, from the ears into the tooth cylinder. There's a rhythm line that happens from the top of the ear towards the tooth cylinder, and then there's another rhythm line in there that we'll take care of soon. We go back up to the eye sockets, lay in the circular shapes for the eyeballs, and then cut out a few distinct planes using rhythms from one side of the head to the other to lock the eyeballs in place. So the planes that I'm putting on around the head are a series of lines that are straighter than that, and they overlap each other. And as you see, each time I overlap a line, I erase a little bit away, or erase the corner away. And that's smoothing out the template, making it more organic and more like the likeness of the sitter. So once you have all the rhythm lines in, then you can go ahead and proceed with the next series of indications, and in this case it's the shadow patterns. The shadow patterns define the light source, define the form, define the direction that the light source is coming from. The eye socket is where I started, the more complex shadow pattern over on the side that has a series of other shadow patterns locked into it, such as the temple, the side plane of the head, the cheek, and so forth. Once those shadow patterns have been linked together and a value has been established, meaning the darkness of the tone that I put in, then I can go ahead and put in shadow patterns elsewhere. The first one sort of defines for the picture the value range that I'm going to be pushing, the average value range that I'm going to be pushing. So getting the other eye socket in for balance across the head. Now I start to work my way down the head into the nose. The cast shadow of the nose. The tip of the nose is casting a shadow over the tooth cylinder. So I'm linking the shadow within the nose as well as that cast shadow together as one simple shape. Then moving over to the cheek planes, filling in the cheek planes with the tone, and I'm easing the shapes into one another. I'm not looking to define anything with harsh barriers. I am looking for shapes, but I'm not trying to define them with anything too rigid or stiff. That would then chisel into the form rather than soften the form, and I am looking for both a shadow pattern as well as form at the same time. Here we're blocking in the neck, getting the biggest shadow pattern in the picture established, and you can see that I'm trying to make the tones as smooth as I possibly can. I don't want the tones to have a lot of variation within them. I want them to be mute or simple, flat, what are called notans. Easy to define, easy to clearly see, and with those simple masses, I can then find the variations within them, or where the gradations occur, where the form turns. Once all of those bigger shapes have been established, then I can go in and I can start marking out the smaller shapes. So what I'm doing now is I'm fleshing into the eye structure, the scale of the iris and the lids, and I'm beginning to push the values a little bit, give the picture a little bit more contrast within the focal center. These pictures have all been drawn without backgrounds so that you can clearly see the figure or clearly see the head as it's drawn. I didn't want to obscure anything with the background. I wanted to keep all of the construction very, very straightforward and very clear to the viewer. Now I'm working towards the smaller shapes. So looking at the eye first, the eyes are the focus of the portrait. I'm clarifying the smaller shapes, and you can see the pencil moving back and forth pretty quickly since this has been sped up a little bit. You're noticing the hand moving a lot more than when I normally draw. The hand is moving very little, but putting in very soft tones. No hard edges, as you can see. I'm trying to wisp the pencil across the surface. Wisping the pencil then means that I'm kind of swirling the pencil or spinning it. The pencil strikes down on the surface very lightly, and when I hit the surface, the edge is soft, and when I lift up on the pencil, the edge is still soft on the other end of that pencil stroke. It makes it easy to connect other pencil strokes to each other. I'll define that more specifically in one of the credit chapters, the bonus chapters. All right, so the eye has been clarified a little bit more, and now I'm starting to lean over into the nose. Since all of this is a socket, I'm trying to unify all of the shapes and the edges of those shapes together. And once I see the edges more clearly, I can define which one is harder, which one is softer, where I can lose things into each other, where I can get rid of information. Anytime you can get rid of something, that's always better than adding more and more to the picture. And that doesn't mean more and more darkness, that means more and more information. If you find a lot of anatomy in the picture, for example, you want to keep that anatomy as subdued or as simple as possible, knowing that when we look at people, the anatomy is there, but it isn't over-clarified. A drawing can do that because we can focus on it too much and we can put too much information in. All right, so continuing on with the eye, I'm now pushing the darker tones. I'm getting the smaller shapes defined, the iris, the pupil, the white of the eye called the sclera, the lid of the eye, the lower lid, the cast shadow from the lid, and possibly the cast shadows from the eyelashes. Those set the standard for the other edges in the picture and the other values within the picture. Then once the eye socket has been taken care of, then I move over into the shadow pattern next to it, the cheek, and then the ear shape. With our model here, he has no hair. It makes it a little bit easier to blend all of those shapes together without trying to define something cutting in between those shapes. So now I'm moving around the eye socket and putting in some of the softer edges, some of the halftones that overlap each other that help blend some of the shapes that I've defined specifically by themselves into each other. The eye socket to the cheek to the nose. There's transitional planes that help get those to connect together, and that's what I'm adding. Now we're going into the nose, and you can see I'm not looking for nostrils. I'm just looking for a shadow. I'm looking for where the edge is defined, where the light meets the dark, and how soft or how hard that is. And then once that's been placed, then I can cast the shadow off of the nose into the muzzle. And since he has a goatee, the hairs around his mouth are fairly similar to the shadow tones. Once those tones have been placed, then I move around the cheek again, moving into the jawline and back into the muzzle. Now I'm moving back up into the nose, and I'm connecting the nose back into the muzzle again, and then the eye into the nose, the eye sockets to each other. And every now and again, you'll notice I'm using my finger to rub out the tones. This is not necessarily a good practice. I know I'm working on newsprint, and newsprint is pretty disposable in terms of its quality of paper. Because it's so disposable, I kind of use it as anything goes surface. If I was working on a nicer sheet of paper, a bond paper or something archival, I would have a different approach to drawing the picture. But knowing that the newsprint is actually pretty forgiving, I'm going to go ahead and abuse it a little bit to learn what I need to learn as I'm drawing my picture. You can see that the little shapes that I put in have angles to them, or have what you would see as structure. I'm looking for corner points, much like if you're looking at a 3D model, you're looking at vector points connecting edges together that form the illusion of a three-dimensional shape. It's very similar to what I'm doing here. Each little shape is a patch of tone, but what that patch of tone is specifically is a change in surface or a change in the anatomy on the surface. The muscle, for example, is not a flat surface. Every muscle has some kind of undulation to it or some kind of extrusion to it. Every bone, the same thing. Tendons, the same thing. So when I can, each little particular surface that I'm designing shows off a little bit of each of those nuances. Every change of value describes a change in a surface or change in direction, facing or going away from the light source. And that's why shading takes so long, because you're controlling this. You're controlling all these subtleties as well as connecting them together. It's one thing to put them all together. It's another thing to connect them all together. That actually takes a lot more time than just finding everything. In this eye socket, you can see that I'm sort of nudging the shapes around as I go. The other eye socket came up pretty quickly because it was mostly in a shadow pattern, and since this one has more value in light surrounding it, it takes a little bit more work to define those edges. I'm going back and forth between finding an edge and losing a value, softening an edge when I'm over-defining, lightening a value up when I'm over blackening something or over darkening something. I'm also looking for the subtleties in the lighter side of things, not just the darker things, but the lighter things as well. The eraser is acting as the white paint, the pencil is acting as the black paint. So I push a little bit of tone in, little bits at a time. My hand is moving quickly because the clock is sped up. It makes it look like I push tone in both directions, but the reality of it is most of the time I'm pushing tone only in one direction. Your hand has to reset itself in order to pull the next brush stroke, so the hand is going to go back and forth. But the tone is only falling in one direction to keep the surface smooth. The nap of the paper can be ripped and destroyed if you push back and forth too often, and it'll make certain areas in the picture look fuzzy or out of focus because the nap of the paper has been destroyed and there's no way of getting that back. The other reason is that by going back and forth, you leave all these little ends, the pencil ends, and I've described that in one of the tutorials. But more specifically, when you go and overlap tones over each other, those ends amplify and become darker, making this little noise in your picture that's very difficult to remove once it's there. So it's a way of keeping things smooth and clean. And here I'm working on the lower jaw. As you can see, it's partially cut off, but the more important part of it is actually in the mouth. I'm moving from the mouth into the cheeks, from the cheeks into the ear, back into the eye, over into the nose, back into the mouth. I'm moving around the picture little by little, bringing it all up together. This way I don't end up overdeveloping something in the picture. And when you overdevelop something, it's really difficult to get everything else to match up to that level of clarity without having some sort of bias towards what you're doing. So everything comes up together at the same time, if possible. There I put in the nostrils finally, and what they are now are just darker marks within the shadow pattern, and they're inside the shadow. They are not defining the edge of the nose. Nostrils are not the edge of the nose. They need to go in, though, when the values have been balanced out. If I push the nostrils in too soon, they become too focal, and the nose then all of a sudden becomes a focal point, and I'm not looking for anything else other than the eyes for the viewer to look at more clearly or more specifically. Thus, the reason why one of the eyes went in first. So now I'm moving into halftones, and halftones are the values that go into the light. These are not the shadows anymore, and sometimes they can be misconstrued for shadows. When a beginner starts off looking at a model from life, one of the difficulties is discerning what is lit and what is in shadow. When everything is in focus, or when our eyes are focusing in on everything specifically, sometimes we tend to forget that there is a light on that object, and we don't see the light from the shade, we just see the object itself, or we see the details. And we tend to draw with those details first instead of looking for and trying to mold the big picture. So here I backed up from the head, and you can see that underneath I haven't developed anything under the chin. I've been connecting things in the face plane into the chin. And that's keeping the values more specific in the face plane and more generalized or more uniform in the larger masses of shadow, the unimportant areas. Some things to think about with ears. The ears are not pasted onto the side of the head. They are actually a part of and integrated into the side plane of the skull. That means that there's stuff in front of them and there's stuff behind them. The line that I pushed behind the ear, or the line that's above the ear, I was looking at and working on softening so that it feels like it passes behind the ear shape. And then the helix, or the hard top edge of the ear, should be sharper so that it feels like it's coming forward. And then one more time, the cheek plane in front of the ear needs to be hard enough to make it feel like the ear is behind it. So there's this series of successive edges that are passing in front of and behind each other. This is one of the parts that we want to slow down when we draw our pictures and take the time to really observe, because the more carefully you observe all of these edges going back and forth in front of and behind each other, you'll take the time to make the right decisions and hopefully clarify them in such a way that it creates a very powerful illusion of reality. And that's ultimately what we're after if we're drawing realism. So I'm working my way around in the muzzle area as well as in the eye sockets, bringing all of those tones together, looking for halftone patches. And each of these halftone patches are hatched in, and you could say that all of them together equate some cross-hatching because of the overlap of the patches. And hopefully, if I get the cross-hatching to push as close together as possible, making uniform tones, you won't notice that it's cross-hatching. You'll just feel the continuous surface. These halftones are very difficult to develop, and they require a lot of patience because they can be overdeveloped very quickly. The eye sockets have lines around them. Those eye sockets, or the lines that are surrounding them, are lids. And the older we get, those lids start to become more defined. And by drawing them in, we can even more define them than what they really are on the face, meaning that we can overdevelop them. So it's a good idea to play them down as much as possible. It's a good idea, in fact, just to play anything down that isn't a major feature. If it isn't inside the eyelids, if it isn't a part of the lips, if it isn't a part of the ball of the nose, if it isn't inside the ear, be careful not to over-describe it. I wouldn't say don't put it in, because it is important that we develop everything up in the picture, but be careful not to over-describe it. Because once all those other bits go into the picture, they can distract us from seeing what we're supposed to be seeing, which is actually the person that we're drawing. Looking into the eyes as if we're looking at somebody that we can talk to. That's what a good portrait should do, is give us that feeling that they're right there in front of us. And overdeveloping shapes can lead to style that can also lead to distraction. So in this demonstration here, I have pushed a few of these edges, but I'm also trying to show the age of the model a little bit. He isn't really young, and he's not really old. So those lines have to have a balance, or else a different age is going to happen in the drawing. It's important to have a collar, or at least a shoulder line, something down below the head to show that the head is anchored to something and not just floating on the page. Portraits tend to look a little bit awkward when it's just a head with no neck, and a head with no neck and shoulders. The goatee has been put in, or the goatee has been darkened, and you can see that the brush strokes that I left in the goatee, as opposed to all of the brush strokes that I've smoothed out around the goatee, I'm trying to imply texture without having to draw every strand of hair. If I just use a few invigorating brush strokes, or tooth, meaning sharper brush strokes that haven't been blown out or softened, it'll show a difference in the surface, and it might equate the texture of what I'm looking for. And I'll manipulate this a little bit more. Right now everything is very graphic and cut out looking, but I have a direction of where I'm going to go with those lines. And then I move back into the other shapes. So the far ear, or the ear on his left side, our right side, has more shadow in it and less defined information within it. So I won't be pushing all the information clearly. I'm going to try to keep it as simple as possible, but I will arrive at some answer with some details in there, because we don't want everything described in the picture and then all of a sudden one area with nothing in it. That would look a little bit odd, and I think that would become a focal center in the picture that we would not so much want to look at, but we would question, because there's a lack of information in it that helps it look like everything else. I'm using the eraser as white paint, and I'm using it to adjust the halftones. I'm not necessarily erasing anything out. I'm lightening things up. So I'm using very light pressure. I've cut the eraser so that it's shaped like a pencil, and I draw with it like a pencil tip, just like I'm doing with the pencil. Both of these tools are hatching lines together on the surface to form the values that I'm looking for, both in the light direction as well as in the dark direction. So this stage of the drawing is called the detailing stage, and the detailing stage is very different from rendering. Detailing means small shapes. It doesn't mean render to death. Rendering means the act of making something look more and more full or three-dimensional. And the small shapes are themselves full, and so the rendering has to do with making those smaller shapes better defined, as well as how do the small shapes connect to the big shapes. These edges that I'm looking at or working on here have to be laid in with a very subtle quality to them, because this is the stage now where we get a little tired towards the end of the picture. This is one sitting. We could take a picture and we could do it over several sittings. We could do it over several hours, several days, several months even. But in the case of drawing for more than 10 minutes, 15 minutes, the brain fatigues, the eye fatigues, the back and shoulders start to fatigue. And when the eyes go, then all of a sudden shapes and values are misjudged, or they can be misjudged pretty easily. This is the time when you want to back up from the drawing a lot. And this camera isn't showing that I'm backing up from the drawing, but I've been backing up from the drawing quite a lot in between so that I can look at the big picture, how everything comes together. My hand keeps drawing the picture, and it shows that I have a close proximity to the pad, but in between brush strokes, I step back from the pad for at least half a moment to look at the big picture. And if it's satisfying enough as a big picture, then I can continue adding more information. If there's something wrong, as soon as I step back, I'm going to notice it right away. And the only thing I do at that point is fix the picture or make the adjustments until that thing has gone away. Here I'm making the cranial mass, or now the forehead mass, what's called the frontalis. These areas, more dimensional. I'm connecting them together with a series of patches. I'm rounding the form out, but I'm also conscious of the structural planes that are in there. The edge of the forehead where the hairline is, the glabella between the eyes, the temple lines on both sides of the eye sockets above the corners of them. Once the halftones have been put in, and they have been put in with some kind of grace or simplicity, the shadows then define, or the areas within the shadows are then better defined, and you can see where tones are either dirty, messy, or out of place. The whole sequence of tones together helps build a hierarchy, and that hierarchy starts with looking into the shadows and making a decision on how dark to go, so that whatever you put into the lights doesn't take away from the darks, and you still have contrast between the light and the dark. And that's what I'm looking for here. I'm trying to push the darks up a little bit, or darker in the lights of the face. And as I do, you can see I keep going back into the shadows and darkening them a little bit more. I'm losing the contrast when I put in those halftones, and I'm gaining it back when I'm going into the shadows and darkening things down. So it's not a redundancy thing. It's actually a build-up process. And that build-up process can happen all across the boards, from the lightest stuff to the darkest stuff. And it can happen over a series of time. Sometimes you'll know exactly what you want to draw, and you'll put it down with conviction the first time, and you won't need to change anything. In a demonstration like this, I'm building up certain aspects of the drawing so that you can see how these are done. And I'm working my way up slowly, because if I kind of blasted them in, which is what I'm going to show in some of the warm-up sketches, things get overlooked pretty quickly in the learning process. Here we are at the corners of the mouth. I pushed the corners of the mouth a little bit darker. I showed that there's something underneath the hair masses. And once I did that, then I looked at the corners of the eyes. And the corners are that edge along the 3/4 line where the side plane changes to the front plane. And those are areas that I work on really hard to get to transition or to change direction through tones. Those are areas that are very difficult to get to transition, and if you can, then all of a sudden the picture really does have a striking resemblance to reality, or 3 dimensions. The eraser now is acting as both white paint and as a texture tool. I'm pushing some textures into the brush strokes so that I can get a little bit of what you might call leathery feeling, or the way skin kind of feels with its pores. I'm attempting to make that clear, and the eraser is doing that, as well as giving direction to the movement of the brush strokes, or the lines that I'm erasing out. And those lines are important because they keep the viewer moving around the picture and not just stagnating in any one area or stalling out in any one place for too long. So now that the big picture has been put in, I'm looking at it, I'm backing up, and I'm double checking. That's what the pauses are for here. I'm looking to see where there might be an issue with balance. I'm also looking to see where there might be an issue with the form not turning as effectively as in all of the other places that have been defined already. The lines are going in a little bit more aggressively. They have an edge to them, or a little bit of tooth. They're showing direction now. I'm not making everything so perfectly smooth. I'm helping define the form by the illusions of what tone can do. And if you put tone in a hatched way or a cross-hatched way, those lines not only define a value, but they also define movement and direction. That's what usually the last few brush strokes are in a drawing. It's helping not only clarify the details, but really trying hard to bring the illusion of volume out to the viewer. If everything is too airbrushy smooth, the values themselves define the form, but we lose a little bit of that luxury of seeing which direction or how much form there really is, which direction the light is traveling over it, or how much volume there really is. And so some of these lines are helping with that. The rest of them are there just to help change the value system in the picture and hopefully create a little bit more structure in the face. Now here, cleaning up the collar, adding a little bit of tone to finalize the image. And the shadow pattern was over off to his left, our right, and he's wearing a dark t-shirt. So I'm extending out the shoulders a little bit and balancing out the head on both sides. Sometimes I might just use the shadow pattern and let it fall over the shoulders, but here I actually needed the shirt to help balance things out. And the shirt is black, but I can't go that black, because if I do, then I won't be able to go any darker for the shadow patterns. As you can see, the goatee is casting a shadow onto the shirt. If I had gone too dark, you wouldn't be able to see that. Now I'm cleaning up the surrounding edges of the head, making sure that the perimeter or the silhouette feels good and balanced enough. One ear in the drawing is lit, the other one is dark, and that can sometimes throw off what looks like balance in the picture. One side of the face being darker than the other can sometimes throw off the symmetry a little bit, and we're looking really hard, or we're looking to define that symmetry all the time and keep that balance as much as possible. Drawing isn't about adding stuff, drawing is about keeping balance, keeping harmony, no matter what it is, whether it's abstract or it's realistic. So finishing the picture off is about fine-tuning things. It's about putting little things in. And here I'm softening a few edges that define his temples. He's an athlete, so he's gritting his teeth a lot. And then what that's going to do is that's going to increase the mass in the masseter muscles. It's going to increase the mass in the temporal muscles. And those are definitely going to be more defined. So here I'm trying to define them, but also keep them from becoming too mechanical looking, trying to keep them as organic as possible, as well as put in some of the fold lines in the skin above the eyes in the forehead without adding too much value to them, possibly making him look older than he actually is. And I am using my fingers a little bit to blend things together. I do admit that I am blending a little bit more with my fingers than I would want to. But again, one more time, with newsprint, newsprint is that disposable paper, and I'm taking advantage of that. The hairs on the mouth, the mustache and the goatee need a little bit of tooth to them at the very bottom edges to show off what they are as a texture. The lines alone aren't going to describe that, especially when I'm putting hatch lines elsewhere in the picture. I have to treat the hatch lines in the goatee and the mustache a little differently so that they look like hair, as opposed to more of the traveling lines that are surrounding the rest of his forehead, the eye sockets, the cheeks, and so forth. The little bits now that I'm putting in are helping turn edges and blend them out. Again, the hand looks like it's going back and forth and putting tone in both directions, but it's actually only dropping tone in one direction. Here I'm darkening the white of the eyes. The white of the eyes aren't actually that white. We need to keep that in mind, especially when the lids are heavier. They're going to cast a lot more shadow into them. And typically at that point, your highlights of your eyes are going to be on your lower lids rather than in the eye itself, especially when the light source is over the head of the model, such as this one. I shot this picture of the model, and I think the light source was almost directly over his head and out in front, maybe about 2 or 3 feet. That's why there's a longer cast shadow on his chin. All right, now I'm defining the edges of the mustache and I'm allowing a little bit of that darkness to slip into the shadow pattern to show a continuation through that space. If I leave that shadow pattern under the nose open or empty, it's going to look a little strange, and it's going to feel like something's been cut away from the picture and not applied or not added back in. That's the problem with realism. Once you go there, everything that you do to the picture to add a little bit more information is going to change how everything else needs to be defined and needs to be described. Here I'm going into the cheekbone and separating the cheek, the zygomate, from the temple, and then I'm rolling the muzzle into the hairs around his mouth a little bit more so there isn't such a cutout barrier. And I'm using the eraser as a tapping tool, and I'm tapping out values instead of erasing them out, and it's just lifting up. The nice thing about kneaded erasers, they have so much versatility. By putting it down over tone and just lifting it up, it peels up a lot of tone with it, and it helps adjust the values. This third drawing that we're going to do is profile. I'm going to start again with a circle, define the front of the face, the back of the head, and the neck, and then connect the jawline. Once this shape has been established, I'll go around and I'll clean up the shape a little bit, make the lines a little more appropriate to the likeness of the sitter, add a shoulder line, add the throat, add the sternal notch so that I know how long the neck is going to be and how to define the neck in relationship to the head. And then I'll go around, because I only have one set of features to work with, I don't have to pair them up. I'm going to look at the profile of the head and be pretty specific about how to map out all the angles of the forehead, the top of the head, the back of the head, and so forth. Now I'm going down through the front of the face and I'm defining the muzzle based upon the slant of the forehead. And then I'm cutting into that rhythm line the eye socket, defining how far back the eye socket cuts into the skull. Using two angled lines that run parallel with each other, that's helping define the two scalloped edges, the inside and the outside scalloped edge of the eye socket together. Then that line leads to the eyeball, which this little half arc here is defined, and then the nose coming off of that. And I'm defining how far away the eyeball is from the edge of the profile of the nose. Now the back of the nose, the nostrils, define that and how it relates to the forehead brow, drawing in the jawline here, relating the ear to the features in the front of the head. Now this model has piercings, and he has a plug in his ear, which is a little bit larger than a standard earring. It's about a 1-inch diameter plug, maybe 3/4 inch, and that has lengthened the ear by the length of the plug. So I do have a different problem to solve here. I won't be relying upon my thirds the way I usually do, because this one particular space has been defined differently. The model is also wearing a goatee, so I had to put that line in out in front of the muzzle so I can relate the muzzle's rhythm to the goatee and remind myself that the goatee is going to weaken the ability for me to see the curvature of the mouth, the curvature of the chin, and so forth. But before I lose it, I must find it. And now I'm going around and defining the contour of the head with a little bit more clarity, the clarity of the curvatures. Now, the last drawing I said that almost every line you want to put into the picture has a straightness to it because you're usually using those as a measuring line. In this case, because, like I said, I'm using one side of the face, one set of the pair of features, one eyeball, one nostril, one corner of the mouth, I'm not too concerned with geometrical symmetry anymore. I'm more concerned now with getting an exactness within the profile. So I'm being a little bit more deliberate with the curves that I'm pushing. And yes, I am pushing curves to make that profile as close to the likeness as I possibly can early on without using tone and shade to get that likeness later on. He's in profile and he's facing towards the sun. So I shot him outside. He has a brightly lit sun light on him facing the front of his head. I'm starting with those features first to cut out their scale before I go to the back of the head and define where the shadow pattern falls over the back of the skull, around the ear, and down the jawline. The back corner of the eye, I'm blurring into the front corner of the eye, all of it together at once, making a uniform tone, and then defining the eyelid as a graphic shape. His eyes are closed down just enough to where we can't see the iris with great detail, so it's more important that I just block out a value and make that space look lit than it is for me to define any kind of detailing in it. Underneath the nose and underneath the mouth, a similar value pattern has been established. I'm not looking for anything of a hierarchy here. I'm looking for sameness. All of these shadows should be defined in the same quality or in the same kind of dark. I'm redefining the front end of the mouth here so that I don't end up losing it early on as I block in the goatee and smudge tones and all that other good stuff. Now I've erased the goatee here, but I will put it back in. It wasn't the right shape and it wasn't doing what I wanted it to. So I got rid of it until I put a few other things in, and then I'll go back and I'll look at that line again and redesign it. I'm going down the side of his face, around the back of the skull, through the temple, into the side plane of the face, into the laugh lines, and then finally landing in the chin. And now I am reestablishing that edge. And I'm going to reestablish that edge because I'm linking up the tones in the shadow pattern to the goatee. His goatee has a lot of white or gray hair in it, but I'm going to darken those hairs down so that we can see more three-dimensional form. The plug I put in graphically, there's really no way around it. It is a graphic shape, and it is mechanical. It is what it is. If I put it in early enough and I establish its quality and character and its scale, it's only going to help me define other things more appropriately. My only loss is that it's very heavily outlined, and I'm going to have to do something about that later on so that the outlines don't end up dominating that particular feature. Here I put in the helix and the antihelix, the concha of the ear, the tragus and the antitragus. That's what all those little notches are. And now I'm drawing parts of the picture you can't see very well, the forehead, the top of the head. And then I reminded myself that, yes, you can't see those areas, so please go back to a part that you can. The lines that I just drew into the ear and darkened, you can see that they sort of make what look like a question mark. Well, that's one of the shapes that the ear can be thought of as a question mark for the outside edge, the helix going all the way around, and then the lobe. And in this case, because he has the plug in his ear, it makes it really well defined that that plug is the circle underneath the swoop in the question mark. Inside of all of that, we have a lowercase y shape, and it's a little bit disguised now, but you can kind of see up in what's called the antihelix, or the little hole under the helix. You can see in that dark marking the two lines that go around it, they form the top of the Y, and as that curves around into the light, that describes the tail of the Y. The ear is the darker spot on the side of the head. It is the whole of the head, while everything else is across the face or across the side plane or across the back of the head. Those areas are going to be broader and they're going to be lighter. So the ear was put up first, darkened down, and now I'm blocking out the entire side plane shadow pattern. And I'm using the pencil on its side, and I'm pushing it in one direction. That's what's giving it its uniform quality of tone. I'm conscious of the little turns of the form, so I'm turning my hand, maximizing the blades, and I can fill in those little spaces, get those edges locked together, and hopefully come out with very few holes that I have to go back in and fill later. I'm looking to make this shadow pattern as uniform as possible. I'm not looking to define anything within it yet. Just make it flat so I can compare the lights to the darks. That's the goal here with the shadows. And having that dark value in locally all over, I can now push darker things, darker accents that help define cutout spaces or help extrude things like the ear and the plug from the rest of the head. The shadow pattern that I'm pulling behind the ear is going to help lift the ear off of the skull and make it so it's not so flat looking in the picture. And of course the bottom of the lobe is going to be casting a shadow as well. It'll be darker there because that's where the ear meets the head. The least amount of light is getting into that space. That's going to be the maximum space where the darkest dark is going to go. Now I'm adding a little bit of gradation to the head. I'm adding it to the back of the neck and the back of the skull to help round it out a little bit and give me something of a form to look at. It makes it a little bit easier then for me to also go back into the jawline, which I think is more difficult to define in its rendered state than the back of the head, which is just a cylinder. Next to the ear, the masseter muscle is going to billow out a little bit, and it's going to cause a small cast shadow to occur on the lobe or a small form shadow to occur within the masseter muscle shape. Having that dark value in now allows me to go around to the eyes and the nose and the mouth and get darker edges put in on them and allow me to start creeping in onto some of the details. These darker values have opened up the field for me in the lights, and now I can start pushing some of the halftones, starting with some of the more important ones around the nose where the cartilage is going to be better defined, under the eye where the lower lid is going to define volume there, and around the muzzle around the laugh lines where it's going to help define overlap of space. At this juncture, I can also push the nostril into the picture because I have the shadow pattern defined and I have the edge of the shadow defined. I know how low and how opened up the nostril should be, as well as how dark and how soft to make it so it doesn't end up competing with those other edges. I'm using these halftones to do a couple of different things. One of them is to describe the cheek and how I'm connecting the cheek to the nose. That rhythm that we usually see that goes around the face is now a line going up the face. The other thing that I'm doing around the mouth is I'm getting the tonal patterns to link up with the hairs in the goatee as well as with the tones in the lips and the shadow patterns. To get the ear to step off of the head a little bit further, I'm defining the interior shapes a little darker as well as behind the helix to darken it up, and it's starting to push the ear off of the head a little more graphically. Around the muzzle, I need to define the shadow patterns from the goatee onto the muzzle as well as the turned muzzle from the light source. It is downward in its plane structure, facing downward or more oblique to the light. It won't be capturing as much light or catching as much light as elsewhere on the face. And at the same time, its halftones are not dark enough to show that it is truly in the shadows, so I pushed them a little bit further. I don't want any ambiguous tones in here. I want everything clearly defined. The viewer is the most important person that we're satisfying here. Obviously, as a draftsman, we need to satisfy our own self in some ways, but it is about the viewer. So I'm thinking consciously about all the decisions I'm making in tones and in edges to help make it easier on the viewer when they look at the picture. So the halftones on the top of the head. He is a darker skinned person. He goes out a lot, or he's in a space where he tans quickly. And he's such a dark-skinned person that I have to be very careful not to push those tones too dark, or else it'll break the ethnicity or break the light. These smaller halftones that I'm pushing into the ear here are helping open up the light inside the ear. The helix, or the top of the ear, has a little more illumination coming through it because of how powerful the sun is. While the back of the ear doesn't have that same quality of illumination, so I have to be very careful how to define one and make it look luminant, how to define the other and make it look dull. I'm pushing the smaller tones into the eye socket to help turn the form. I'm more conscious of this front edge here because that is where the eye is going away from us or turning away from us. So I'm paying more attention to darkening those edges and letting them lighten up as they pass around the eye socket. And once the eye socket has been defined with its darker values, being that it should be a focus of sorts, I can then go into the halftones around the eye socket and bring them up. And the eye socket's ultimate darkness is what controls how dark all these other halftones can go. So here I put in a little bit of faux texture into the goatee for the moment. Partly as a placeholder for me and a reminder that I have something difficult down here to deal with. The other part of it is that I'm looking at the rhythms. There's a rhythm going from the lip into the goatee, and I'm looking for those rhythms early on so that the drawing has more excitement to it. Those rhythms lead to what is like a racetrack, and I'm linking every curve of the racetrack together so that I get a longer track out of it, more to race around. I'm defining things for the viewer so that the viewer has more to look at. The lines in the eyes right now are placeholder lines. They're defining the different layers of lids, lashes, lower lid, etc. And they're going to be defined a little bit more clearly right now because I'm putting them in. But as I build up this cheek and darken things down, I'm sure I'm going to go into that eye socket and soften things up one more time. There shouldn't be competition amongst the little things, just as there shouldn't be competition amongst the big things. There should only be harmony. All things should point to each other or lead to each other or define each other more clearly or harmoniously. Remember that art is a language, and all of these things are tools that help make those paragraphs that we write or those sentences that we're writing out more meaningful. And we have the same thing going on as in a drawing. Everything that we put into it is more meaningful to the final outcome of the picture or the way other people look at it, how they feel when they look at it. These edges that I'm pushing now in the front, I'm pushing a little bit darker to help power up the source of light. The sun isn't very strong right now on the model, so I'm making sure that the core shadows or the front edge of the shadow patterns begin a little bit darker so that there is a greater contrast to those front planes that are lit. And I could take advantage of the underside of the throat and push a dark value in there. It's an advantageous place to put it, and it's out of the way of anything in focus. But you can see every now and again I go to the outside on the paper and I erase things off. That is, yes, me erasing fingerprints and smudge marks and so forth. I'm sort of a clean freak, and I like my drawings to have that quality to them. In the end, I like them to be clean. And as I'm drawing along, anything that ends up out of the picture will end up smudging somewhere and diminishing the value of the paper surprisingly enough. If you slide your hand across the page enough, you'll drag tone with it. And sometimes that tone is so subtle you won't notice the difference. But sure enough, it's there. This is that stage of the drawing again that I get back from it as often as possible. Where before this, I definitely get back from the drawing, but I don't need to back up as frequently as in this stage of the drawing. This stage is more critical that I back up from it and make certain that all things are starting to harmonize, come together, and or soften and blur. So all the tone patches that I'm adding, I'm making sure that they blend in to the bigger patch. All things are constantly coming back to this big patch. And I'm sneaking up on it little bit by little bit. Some of the areas in the drawing look a little bit darker than they should. That'll be something that if I don't address it in the demo, I will certainly address it afterwards and try to bring the picture around to a greater finish. Those darks need to be a little darker so I can accomplish this stage of the game more successfully, adding halftones, and adding halftones that are a little bit darker than most people's halftones usually would be. Eric is he's out in the sun a lot, and because of that, his skin is going to be a lot darker, which it is, making things a little bit more difficult to define whether something's lit or something's in the shadows or something's in a halftone. The erasing that I'm doing right now is blasting out the highlights of the picture space, or it's at least attempting to do that very thing, to get the form to turn and to make the form feel a little bit more organic in its structure. Now I'm building these edges between the light and the dark, and I'm making them a little bit darker. That helps me darken down the halftones in the lighter spaces, but what it does do is it creates a barrier between the light and the dark on the darker side. Rest assured, I will get there. There's a build-up process that's important. As I focus in each area of the drawing, I need something to help that space, to help me define what's going on in that space. These darker edges along the barrier between the light and the dark are really important for me right now to get all these halftones to roll convincingly and to get me to push the darker values into the features where they need to go. It's very easy to push darks all over the place. And they just shouldn't be everywhere. They should be concentrated in specific places. His eyes, while they're turned away from us, still have some kind of focus to them. There still is an emotional quality to them that we are trying to relate to as human beings. As far as the nose and the mouth are concerned, they're not as important. They're further away from us, and they really are just there to help us define the likeness of the person, but they aren't key attributes. Unless I were to have the model yelling or something, then the mouth isn't all that important. But their values are. They all need to remain constant so that they all clearly depict the same point in space. The middle of the eyes, the tip of the nose, and the middle of the mouth are all in the same area of space. They're all in the very middle of the head. All of those edges should sort of feel like they belong together. So yes, I'm in the shadows now, darkening them down and matching up the outlines to the cores or to those terminator points that I defined earlier for the lighter side of the head. Bringing all the values closer together here is making the shadows more uniform, getting rid of those outlines that were harsh and aggressive, and it's definitely helping clarify what is lit and what's in shade. It's doing its job effectively the way it should. The halftones on the back of the skull do need to get a little bit darker. I have to be careful not to break the illusion of the roundness of the head, but I do need to transition them a little bit more since the back of the skull is facing away from the light source. But not enough to where the edge of the light and the dark completely loses ground in the drawing. Those edges are important because the viewer can't understand what they're looking at if the light and the shade are obscured in any ways. That's what this whole stage of the drawing is about, holding on to the clarity between the light and the shade, as well as add more details and hopefully not add them to the detriment of losing that clarity between the light and the shade. Part of what's going to make the lit side work better is by having the lightest areas not so lit. By having them as light as they are all over, it's sort of making the lit side of the head a little more confused or a little bit more, a little bit busier than the shadowy side, which it's supposed to be because we gave ourselves that opportunity by flattening out the shadows and darkening them down. But having too much extreme contrast in the light side can overdo it as well. I'm creeping down on all the values, pushing them a little bit further and isolating the highlights, making them more important in smaller concentrated areas and not so broad and spread out over the entire space. The eraser is being used as a softening tool now, not an erasing tool. It's helping blur edges where the pencil over-defines things, and you can see almost every time I push the pencil, I also push the eraser. Both tools are kind of synchronistic to each other, and I wish I had a finger for each tool instead of having to close my fingers down around each tool, and I can keep them both out there readily available all the time. But they are both being used, the white paint and the black paint. Drawing isn't just about putting pencil strokes down, it's also about what you leave behind, and sometimes that's better defined by the eraser than by just not putting it in. The eraser, what I mean by that is that the eraser in its blurring process can knock down a few things that we have overdone, but put it in its perfect place between a perfect texture and a perfect value relationship. Sometimes that eraser will make pencil strokes look just like skin. And, you know, if we're drawing a portrait, we want it to be as believable as possible, all the way to the finish of, or the illusion of somebody actually being able to talk to this person or think that they really are there. And I would hope that most people are intelligent enough to know that a drawing isn't really a person there, but our illusions can be powerful enough to fool the mind into making them believe that that person is there even though they really aren't. The magic of art is that very thing. In commercial art, we lose that magic a little bit and substitute it with style. And I think that's why a lot of art tends to feel or why a lot of people tend to feel that art isn't as important as it could be or should be. We don't experience those magical illusions enough, not all of us. And the museums are where you can experience that, the power of the old masters. And it isn't what they said, it's how they said it, because a lot of us are not going to relate at all to what they said, but we're going to relate to the experience of viewing the picture. The impact of that view is going to make us feel something, even though we don't know what the subject matter is necessarily. And that feeling, that power that has gone on through the quality of the art, that power is the illusion of life. And that's the magic of doing great art. That's the purpose of realism, is to kind of fool the eye and give us that feeling. And if you couple that with a powerful message, and a message that the people of the time can relate to, then you have an amazing, powerful piece of artwork, and not just a quality craftsman-like piece, or an interesting stylistic piece. These are warm-up drawings. This first warm-up drawing, I'm going to draw a 3/4 view head bottom lit. And there's all sorts of problems when you bottom light something, because it reverses all the concepts that we have been practicing towards under normal lighting conditions. Normal lighting conditions being overhead lit. This being a warm-up, I'm not starting with anything too formal. No formal structure here other than the boundary of the head. I have started with a contour of sorts, so I have an enclosure or a space to put everything else into. But as I'm putting the picture information together, I'm not being too academic about it. I'm not being too literal towards a course of action about it. But you can see that all of those steps that we learn in that literal process, all of those steps are taking place in the drawing. They're just scattered about now. I'm using tools out of order instead of in sequence. The nice thing about a drawing versus construction, I don't need to have 2x4s cut ahead of time to build up the foundation. I can actually just put a few things in here and there, and that acts enough as a bit of foundation for me that can serve the purpose of helping me put more information into the picture. By drawing this way in this freestyle fashion, what I'm doing in respect to the technical part of it is I'm looking for edge and I'm looking for shape. The edge is the outline, the shape is the tone. And I'm working with both of them together successively to help build up the picture, one little bit at a time. I blasted in the back of the hair so that I've defined the darker areas and defined the majority of the skull. And then that helps me balance out all of the little shapes that I'm putting into the features in the front of the skull. I'm working towards a finish as I start. I'm hoping that I can find all the right edges and values in the turn of the form all at the same time. And when that doesn't happen, it doesn't mean I can't go back in and work on it. It just means that those spontaneous brush strokes are going to be lost to a little bit more work. These warm-ups are a couple of different things. One, it's an exercise in practicing your tool sets and letting go of them to see what you know about what you're looking at and how to define it technically as a craftsman. The other thing this exercise is doing is it's allowing me to quote-unquote freestyle my drawing, or find a way of putting a picture together without using all those rules that hopefully help me become me more specifically as an artist. At some point, those academic rules, everybody using them blurs together a little bit, and unless we kind of find a few functions that help separate us apart, everybody ends up looking a little bit the same. So these freestyle moments for me are helping me also kind of look for me, my way of working, my way of putting tones down, and they're definitely practice for shading, making sure that I still know how to, making sure that I still have the dexterity to perform the way I need to. As a career artist, you have to keep those things up. It's practice. Very much like a musician has to continue practicing scales and all the other basic elements of music making. They have to continue practicing those, otherwise they go a little rusty in them. And I definitely don't want to go rusty, especially if I'm teaching somebody how to do something. Or if I'm doing something for a commission, I better not be rusty. Every now and again, you'll see my pencil break. Our modern day equipment is not so sturdy. I'm barely pushing a lot of the time in these drawings, and yet the leads will snap on me all the time. In this case, charcoal. The charcoal will snap. Materials aren't poorly made necessarily, but they are poorly distributed. Pencils are not put into special crates with pressure-sensitive walls and so forth. They're stuck in a cardboard box like everything else. And if you work at UPS or at a post office, or if you've ever been to one of those and seen how they work, a lot of the time the guys are throwing those boxes around. They're not handling them delicately the way you think they should. And a lot of the time in shipping, these pencils already start to crack and break. Generals is notorious for having soft charcoal. And if they're handled poorly, they can break before they're ever sharpened. And that can be the case, and many times is the case with me when I go to buy brand new pencils. I'll go through about 3 or 4 of them before I actually have one I can work with, which is sad because that's all that money gone. And most art stores don't replace a broken pencil. I save all the little chunks, however, and grind them down into charcoal powder and use that later on. At least I'm getting my money's worth somewhere. Charcoal powder is just as valid a material to draw with as the charcoal pencil. I'm using the pencils here, however, for practical purposes and for mechanical purposes. But later on in one of the DVDs, I'll go over a demonstration using charcoal powder. Just like all of the long drawings that you'll be watching on this DVD, this drawing is going through a series of value relationships between lights and darks. I'm not using outlines, I'm using tones to help me balance out the realism of this picture, where the light source is coming from. I'll define an edge with a line, and then I'll fill it with a tone. So, as I said in the very beginning of this particular drawing, I'm working with 2 tools, tones and outlines, and they're going hand in hand with each other. The tone is the fence I put up, or the outline is the fence that I put up, and the tone is the grass that I fill the yard up with. I'm softening these values here by adding broader strokes of tone, and then when I need to get specific about a feature, I'll lean up on the pencil tip more, like I'm doing here in the mouth. I'm being more specific with the tip of the pencil than I am with the broad side of the pencil. And then going back into these bigger spaces, I'll use the broad side of the pencil a little more liberally and not think too much about sharp or tight or little. Most of the broad strokes are just that. They're very large, broad strokes covering ground very quickly, lots and lots of ground very quickly. When I stall out here in the drawing, I'm comparing shapes. I'm looking at the model and I'm looking at my drawing and I'm trying to find out where the measurement is off. And that's what we need to do a lot. We need to back up from our drawing and take in the big picture. It's very difficult to step back from the picture and look at the whole thing. We typically get caught up in the last marking that we put into the picture or the last feature that we just tried to define. And we have to really generalize when we back up. We can't be that distinct because when we do, that's a detail, and those details will tend to overshadow the big picture, and it is the big picture that we're after, not the details. The hypocrisy of draftsmanship. We're making a big picture. The big picture is about all things at once. But in order to do that, we have to focus on all the little pieces one at a time. That is where most pictures fall apart. By building up the little pieces and forgetting the big picture, all those little pieces can fracture a picture by having too many shapes, too many values, and too many edges in their spaces, where other places are very bland and generic or generalized. There needs to be a distribution of balance between little shapes, big shapes, soft edges, and hard edges, and all of them for the effect of the big picture. Backing up from the picture allows us to see all of this at once. When we're developing up the small features, we're looking at one space at a time. And we're not so much conscious of the big picture unless we practice that, unless we practice looking at small things and constantly arrive at a bigger conclusion when we do. The differences here in this warm-up versus the longer, more finished drawings that I do here on this DVD, the difference is the way I'm approaching it. I'm being more general with the strokes, and I'm being simpler with the mechanics of the drawing. I haven't put in a jaw line. I haven't put in the three-quarter line along the edge of the cheek to the zygomate to the corner of the mouth. I've neglected to put those bits of information into the picture, and I'm going for a broader, more general brushstroke. So I stall out a lot more to look at the big picture, because without those little defined things in there, I'm really on my own, and I'm kind of in the unknown looking for things and how things come together. Practicing this more often makes those unknown things a tool, a useful tool. And what I mean by that is that I'm learning how to draw a picture, moshing the tools up. And when I do that, I have to look for different traits within the drawing. Each time I draw this way, I practice that particular routine, and it makes it a little bit easier for me to see the things that I'm supposed to see specifically. It becomes my style or my way of working. Just like several years in school define a certain way of working in you, because that's the only way you work while you're in school, that one particular way. So now I'm looking at the smaller shapes, and I'm using the pencil tip more often than I'm using the broad side of the pencil. I'm defining sharper clarity amongst the features. I'm looking for termination points where the light or the gradations need to end. So sometimes these edges that I put in or these lines that I put in aren't necessarily going to be sharp, but they are specific. They are the boundary to stop things from moving. And I use the analogy of a yard a lot. The outlines are the fences and the tones are the grass that's in the yard. And when I can, I try to playfully define things in that sense, because when I try to define things more technically, that's when things get a little confusing in drawing. Sometimes the technical rules that we learn get altered, or they're broken in substitution for a better technical rule or a better solution that sometimes doesn't require technical at all, but just a keen eye, good observation, good taste, and the know-how to arrive at a better conclusion. When I'm working on one eye, I'm working on both. I'm trying to pair them up as much as possible. In the case of this light source, it is obscuring the balance of the features a little bit. It's playing a little bit of a problem to the balance of them, making one side feel sharper and the other side feel blurrier. So it is up to me to overdevelop sometimes a few edges here and there in the picture to create a stronger sense of balance or a stronger sense of the likeness. Here I am putting in the neck and the collar, and you won't see that until I back the camera up, but it is important to have a collar in the picture, or a neckline, or a shoulder line, so the head isn't just floating on the page. This drawing would definitely benefit from a lot of tone in the front of it to help make this face feel like it's glowing, and I will probably do that on another sitting away from the video camera. All of these drawings being is that they're just warm-ups for the longer, more mechanical drawings, the longer demonstrations. I wasn't too concerned about making pictures here. I'm more concerned about just getting my brain up to speed with seeing features and looking at values and knowing how to balance tones and edges and remembering what it is that I'm supposed to be doing. All of that stuff does take a little bit of time. That's what warm-ups are for. I would probably, as a good bonus rule, I would probably put in the back of my mind not to start a drawing raw, not to start a drawing just by walking over to the art table and beginning, but to start the drawing process off with a few warm-ups of some kind, whether they be shape exercises, tone exercises, practicing drawing circles or ellipses, practicing straight lines, gradations, or what have you. Any of those things that you can start off with is going to warm you up. It's going to get your arm and wrist warmed up. Just like in sports, stretching is a good thing. And these are our kind of shorthand stretches that get us a little closer to flexible and our brain a little more conscious from where we were just previously, more aware and more alert of the artful things that we're going to be trying to accomplish as we draw a picture. When we draw, we definitely switch up our brain and we don't think the way we normally would. We have to turn off all of the tools that tell us to not bump into the wall here, to be able to pick something up over there, to define something as we look at it. The apple is that, the person is this, that is Joe, that is Bob, that is Jane, blah, blah, blah. Those are definitions. That's our dictionary mind. The dictionary mind has to shut off, and we have to turn on the shape recognition mind, the value and edge recognition mind. The more technical aspects of art, those have to be tuned up and turned on for us to draw pictures. Without those things on, without our conscious awareness of what those things are that we're supposed to be looking for, we could mindlessly draw our way into a whole bunch of problems. Here I'm starting to put in some of the sharper edges that define that light source from underneath, that underlighting. And it feels to me like the camera might have been a little bit bright on this shot because some of the halftones feel a little lighter than they could be in reality. But I am going to go back through all of these drawings one more time and clean them up a little bit, reshoot them, and apply them to the DVD so that you can see what more of a finish would look like where I just didn't have enough time for any of these drawings, including the warm-ups. But what I did benefit from these warm-ups is a little bit more speed, a little bit more confidence and speed to get something done in a short amount of time and define all of the different aspects of how I'm building the picture along the way. So with this picture process here, with this warm-up, I started backwards. I didn't start with any lines. I'm actually kind of finishing with those lines. I started with bigger tones. The broader side of the pencil helped me place those broad tones into the picture space. And then from there, I tuned up instead of loosen up. I'm tuning up to a finer detail. I'm tuning up to the sharper edge or the point of the pencil. I'm tuning up to the more clarity within the picture space. All of those things I'm doing at the end of the drawing instead of at the beginning of the drawing. And I can do those now because the picture base, what's underneath, the simple setup, was solid enough for me to follow. I don't really have anything obscure or unknown in the picture where it would be a battle or very difficult for me to define something. I sneak up on the shapes little bits at a time as you're watching here, patches of tone, one patch at a time. I push only so hard with the pencil because it should be the pencil's weight that defines the tone that you apply, not the heavy-handedness of your arm and your hand. Drawing sideways like this prevents you from knuckling down on the picture and weighting everything down from your fingertips. Using the pencil on its side, it's helping me draw from my shoulder. Although it does look like I'm just drawing from the fingertips, I'm actually not. I'm drawing from the shoulder. My hand is wiggling back and forth to put tone down, but you can see how freely my arm is moving and my hand is going in different places, and I'm able to pitch it at different angles, holding the pencil vertically or sideways, horizontally, or at an angle, freely because I'm not restricted by one way of holding the pencil. Holding it sideways allows me to kind of flip the pencil through my fingers, hold it at the back, hold it at the front, and all the while it's my shoulder that's helping me define all of the values and the edges that I'm putting in. And the fingertips are nothing more than the little mechanical tool holding the pencil so that it doesn't go flying out of my hand. Now I'm on the last wave of this warm-up, and as a warm-up will be, these aren't going to be particularly beautiful and quality finishes, but they're good enough for me to say, yes, I'm in the right working mode and I can do something to a finish and feel pretty confident about it. And this warm-up has definitely helped me see that. With such a difficult light source as this one is with bottom lighting or up lighting, I'm able to control the lighting a little better now by seeing those brighter spots. And the difficulty of this is it lights the understructure of all of the features, not the top side of all of the features. That makes it really hard sometimes to look at the proportions of things, look at the big picture proportions. They will be thrown in reverse a little bit because the lighting is bouncing in a different direction. And sometimes they'll make a nose look a lot longer than it actually should be, or an eyeball a lot larger than it should be, because those cast shadows are so subtle and they're blending right in with some of the very edges of the features, making them look a little longer than they actually should, or wider. You can see that I'm being careful not to push the lights too much. I'm reserving them for the very end of this drawing here. And I'm pushing a lot more halftones into the lights, just so they're not blown out equally all over. They should be at their brightest at the bottom of the head, and then they should diminish a little bit as they creep up towards the eye sockets. And that's why I'm putting in these last bits of tone here at the top of the head. Rolling the top of the skull a little bit darker, helping push the shadow back into that space where it isn't yet. And it's helping make the lighter side more convincing. It's definitely telling us where the light source is coming from, where I think about 10 minutes ago into this drawing, it might have been a little unknown where that light source is coming from.